Well, good evening, or good afternoon. I guess it's good afternoon, and actually we're not to evening yet. Matthew chapter 7, let's start there tonight. Matthew chapter 7, and while you open your Bibles to that passage, let me just say a couple things before we get started. Thank you again so much for the invitation to come and to be a part of this weekend. And it is my sincere prayer that it has been helpful to you as we've worked our way through these lessons, that you've been encouraged to some extent, that you've been challenged to another extent to do better as we seek to serve our Lord. It's good to be with you. Thank you so much for the encouraging words that you've given to me. Always good to be with Russ and Tracy, and to be with Devin is it's a blessing as well. I love Devin, but he and I don't mind messing with him, and he don't mind messing with me. So, I love Devin, and so good to be with them as well. One thing you probably don't know about me is that I'm actually retired from public supermarkets in Florida. I retired. You didn't know that, Russ, did you? Did you know that? Okay. I retired at the age of 26. I was vested. Publix, you were, at least at that time, I'm not sure anymore. But so what that means is I started when I was 16 years old working for Publix. That was in the year 1976, so I'll let you do the math on that part, okay? And when I started with Publix in 1976, the average grocery store stocked around 7,000 items. Today, that number is more than 40,000 items. And not only are there more products in every grocery store, but there is a much greater diversity among each of those products. And so, for example, in 1976, we had, and I would often stock, 3 choices of Cheerios. Cheerios in a little box, Cheerios in a middle box, Cheerios in a large box, okay? Today, there are 16 different kinds of Cheerios. So you've got apple cinnamon and chocolate and frosted. Honey Nut Cheerios, by the way, came out in 1979, in case you get in some kind of a trivia contest. Now you know that piece of information. In 1976, there were 2 main kinds of Oreos, and if we use the previous scenario, we could say there was 4. There was the regular Oreos in a small and a big package. There were the double stuffs that had just come out. Delicious, by the way, 1975, okay, in both the small and the large package. Now you're thinking, where's this going? What all of that illustrates is that in our culture today, we are inundated with a variety of choices that are available to us. That more than ever before, you and I get to pick and choose based on our own personal preferences. We get to decide based on what we like and what we want. And by the way, just my opinion, but regular Cheerios and regular Oreos are still the best. I'm a traditionalist when it comes to that kind of stuff. Choices in regard to cereal and cookies are unimportant. By the way, let me just say this, a lemon Oreo is just wrong. I mean, that ain't no Oreo, so let's just get that in there. But there are other decisions that we make that are in realms that are complex, and they possess vital significance. There are areas in our life where choices really matter. And nowhere, of course, is that more true than in the spiritual realm. And so as we finish our look of looking in the mirror tonight, I just want us to think about the choices that we make. And when we get there, we're going to look at a couple of examples of some men who made some very different decisions and where it took them. The reality is that it is that the direction and the quality of our lives are determined not so much by the circumstances that we are in, but rather the decisions that we make in the midst of those circumstances. That vitally everything, or virtually everything that we do that affects us spiritually is the result of a choice, either a choice to participate in something or to avoid something, to stand firm or to succumb, to follow or to fail. And we see the importance of choices, don't we, from the very beginning with Adam and Eve. Sometimes we make choices that are based on things that are tangible and visible, and other times we make our choices based on things that we cannot see, things instead that we have to simply trust. Sometimes we make decisions that are sound and good, and as a result of that, we reap the benefits of those choices in our lives, and then there's other times where we make foolish and poor choices, and we suffer the lasting consequences that are attached to those choices. But in the end, our character and our lives are molded and shaped, ultimately not just by the decisions that we make, but as we navigate our way through life, we learn from both the good ones and the bad ones that we've made. And where we find ourselves at this moment in time in life, whether we're talking about financially or relationally or emotionally or vocationally and certainly spiritually, boils down to decisions that you and I have made in the past. And where we go from this moment hinges on the choices that we start making now. Your Bible's open to Matthew chapter 7. Notice, if you will, verses 13 and 14. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 7, verse 13, "Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is broad that leads to destruction, and there are many who enter through it. For the gate is small and the way is narrow that leads to life, and there are few who find it." You've got 16 varieties of Cheerios, and you've got 21 varieties of when it comes to Oreos, but Jesus makes it clear when it comes to life, there's two choices. That's it. No third option, just two. There is God's way, that's one option, and then there's every other way that's not God's way, and that's the other option. And again, choices in terms of cereal or cookies are trivial and insignificant. This choice, however, is life-altering, isn't it? It is essential. It is a choice between one and many. It is a choice between a single right way and a host of wrong ways. And Jesus, as he is beginning to wind down his Sermon on the Mount, he calls upon his listeners to render a verdict, if you will, on what he has just communicated to them. You'll notice in verse 13, the New American Standard begins with enter. Enter. In other words, it is a word that implies a definite, specific action. There is a choice that has to be made. He doesn't say to just admire the narrow gate. He says to pass through the narrow gate. And then he adds that these two gates, on the other side of those gates, there is two different paths. One of those paths is easy and attractive. It is inclusive and indulgent. It doesn't require any commitment. It doesn't demand any moral character. There is no sacrifice that is necessary. The narrow way, however, is hard and it is difficult. It is the way of sacrifice and self-denial. And you'll notice at the end of verse 14 that Jesus makes sure that we understand that there is no one who stumbles by accident onto the narrow path. He says, few there are who find it, which means you have to be looking for it. As one might also expect, those two gates that open the way to two different paths ultimately take you to two different destinations. And Jesus tells us here that the broad path, though there's not a neon sign that's hung up above it that says this is the way to hell, that's where it takes you. The narrow path has a very clear sign above it, and it says this is the way to life. And I want us to look at a couple of individuals now. Two men who made different decisions, who traveled on different roads, and hopefully we can learn something from them and the decisions that they made. And to see how important choices can be. Those of us who've lived a little longer can look back in our life and we can see a choice that altered the direction of our life forever. So go back to the book of Genesis. I want to start with the example of Lot. We're going to ultimately get to chapter 13. Just let me mention this, that in chapter 12, that most of us are familiar with, we find there that Abraham makes, or Abram, as he's known in that chapter, he makes the faithful decision to heed the command of God, and he is going to leave his home in the Ur of Chaldees and to go wherever God instructs him to go. And when he sets out, chapter 12 and verses 4 and 5 tells us that his nephew Lot is traveling along with him. The entourage spends a little time in Egypt at the end of chapter 12, and by the time we get to chapter 13 and verse 6, that in the ensuing years, we now find that there has been an accumulation of wealth to the extent that it creates problems between the herdsmen of Abram and the herdsmen of Lot. And so, picking up our reading in chapter 3 and verse 6, the land could not sustain them while dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to remain there. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. Now the Canaanite and the Perizzite were dwelling in the land. So Abram said to Lot, "Please let there be no strife between me and you, nor between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brothers. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If to the left, then I will go to the right, and if to the right, then I will go to the left." It may be a situation of where Abram is concerned with the influence that he's having on the pagans. That may be part of that parenthetical reference. It also is, I think, playing behind this is the fact that, remember, this is being written for the nation of Israel in the days of Moses. And so this is not being written in real time. And so it's important for the children of Israel in Moses' day. They may be thinking to themselves, well, wait a minute, this land that God promised to us can't even sustain two rich guys? Well, here's why. Because the Canaanites are still living in the land. They haven't gotten everything that God is going to promise to Israel. Whatever the situation that's driving this, Abram's solution is pretty simple. We need to separate. And he humbly and magnanimously gives Lot first dibs. Whatever direction, Lot, you go, I'm going the opposite direction. And Lot is going to make a choice that is going to forever negatively affect his life. Picking up in verse 10, Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the valley of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go to Zoar. So Lot chose for himself all the valley of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled in the cities of the valley and moved his tents as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked exceedingly and sinners against the Lord. Do you notice the criteria by which Lot makes his choice? And by the way, if this sounds similar to Eve back in Genesis chapter 3, I think there's an intentional play here as well. He looks, he sees, and he makes a choice, just like Eve did. It is a choice based on what he can see. And what he sees is a way of life that is potentially easy and especially profitable. He looks out and he sees a green and lush valley. It's well watered. In fact, the writer, Moses, describes it as though it was the Garden of Eden. It is like Egypt that's watered constantly by the Nile. It's going to require a lot less labor on Lot's part. It is going to be a place where prosperity and success is going to seemingly be a given. Remember the choice here. Abram's going to go to Canaan. And in that section down in there, it's pretty dry, mountainous terrain. Water is fairly scarce. You'll remember that Abraham's going to have to dig a lot of wells in order to survive that. That's a lot of hard work. Or I can go live over here. I can go over to this well-watered valley that's verdant with the necessary vegetation for all of my livestock. There's a sense in which this is a choice between the narrow and the broad way. What gate is Lot going to go through? Well, he's already made his decision. He makes his decision selfishly. He doesn't leave the Green Valley for his uncle. And he makes it superficially. There's no consideration in his mind for the environment, the place to which he's going to move his family. Abraham, on the other hand, is simply content to leave it in the hands of God. Whatever direction you go, I'm going to go the other direction. He's trusting in God's promise in regard to the land. And that, by the way, is the end of chapter 13. We won't look at that. But God reiterates his promise to Abram, and he uses much the same terminology that is used of Lot. Lift up your eyes, Abram. Look out. Travel around. This is the land I'm going to give to you. Lot makes a choice based on what he wants at that moment in time. It's founded on what he can see. It's based on the profit that it's going to bring. But he doesn't take into account the danger it's going to bring to himself and his family. And his choice is just like some of our choices, isn't it? We make choices based on what appeals to self. We make decisions based on what's going to make us successful. We base our choices on what we can see and what we desire at a moment in time, and oftentimes we make that choice without thinking about where that choice is ultimately going to lead us. Now, Lot's decision admittedly looks pretty smart from a human perspective. But as we're going to see, Lot will rue the day when he makes this one decision in his life. Chapter 13 and verse 12, he initially moves his tents as far as Sodom, but now turn over to chapter 19. Because by the time we reach chapter 19, there has not only been an unspecified amount of time that's passed, but we now find he's no longer pitching his tents towards Sodom, he's actually living in Sodom. And you'll notice in verse 1 that Lot is sitting in the gate. This is an indication that Lot's not just a resident of the city, but Lot is he's become some sort of an official within the city, a leader of some kind. Back in chapter 18, because of some negotiations that Abram has with the Lord, he's Abraham by that point in time, God sends a pair of angels to rescue Lot and his family prior to the city being destroyed. And as the angels enter, there's Lot seated at the gate in an act of hospitality. He invites those travelers to come to his home for the night. He prepares a meal. They're about to settle in for the night. And it's at that time there's a knock on the door. And in verse 5, the men of the city have come and they are insisting that Lot allow his visitors to come out. And they make some sensual demands of them. Now remember, the people that are knocking at Lot's door are his neighbors. These are the people that Lot has chosen to live among. And you'll notice in verse 9 that their assessment of him, they said to Lot, stand aside. Furthermore, they said, this one came in as an alien and he's already acting like a judge. By the way, the word alien there literally in Hebrew is sojourner. We'll see that it seems that, Lot, there must have been this temporary nature that he's not going to stay around. And we'll see that with the son-in-laws. They want him to send out his guests. You're an outsider. You're trying to dictate to us what's acceptable and what's not. And of course, the angels eventually strike all of the men blind. And in verse 11, just as a side note, notice how depraved those men are, that they are miraculously struck blind and they weary themselves trying to find the door. Those guys are evil. Now, the verses that finish out the chapter contain the consequences that are connected to one choice that Lot makes, to pitch his tents towards Sodom. And so, verse 8, we see the first one. He said, behold, Lot says, I have 2 daughters who have not had relations with men. Please let me bring them out to you and do to them whatever you like. Only do nothing to these men inasmuch as they have come under the shelter of my roof. Lot's lost his mind. Now, I understand that it was true in that day and time, and it's certainly true even today, that in that part of the world, hospitality is seen as an incredibly important responsibility. It's not any more important than the parental responsibility toward his daughters. It's as though Lot thinks he can correct one wrong if he allows his neighbors to correct or to commit another one. And so Lot's desire to protect his guests, that's certainly commendable, but for him to feed his daughters to this crowd is, in my mind, reprehensible. Verse 14. Lot went out and spoke to his son-in-laws who were to marry his daughters and said, "Up, get out of this place, for the Lord will destroy the city." But he appeared to his son-in-laws to be jesting. Now, a couple of things here. It's commendable on Lot's part because we skipped over some of it where they want to kill Lot. It's commendable that Lot is willing to risk his life to go out into the city that has just threatened his life, and his purpose for doing that is also admirable because he's wanting to warn his son-in-laws or his future son-in-laws about pending judgment. But did you notice the response? He's just kidding. He's not serious about this. In fact, the Hebrew word here spoke of laughing outright. It was sometimes used to describe a mocking kind of laughter. And that, I think, ties back into the fact that he was a sojourner. I think that Lot, for a period of time, had said, hey, I'm done with this place. We're getting out of here. We're leaving. The Lord's going to destroy this place. How often had he verbalized his frustration with the sin that he saw going on around him? How many times had he threatened to pack up the family U-Haul and to leave town? Had Lot cried wolf so many times that when it actually comes time for God to destroy the city, that some of those who were the closest to him, his son-in-laws or future son-in-laws, there's some discussion as to which is the case, he cannot convince them of the urgency of this matter. They think he's just kidding. Verse 15. When morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or you will be swept away in the punishment of the city." But he hesitated. So when the men seized his hand and the hand of his wife and the hands of his 2 daughters, for the compassion of the Lord was upon them, and they brought him out and put him outside of the city. He's lost his will to act. Even though he's well aware of the calamity that has been divinely promised, when it comes right down to that moment in time, Lot hesitates to leave it behind. Now, we're not told why he hesitated. What we are told is that the deliverance of Lot and his family is not the result of Lot's incredible spiritual leadership. It's not the result of his insightful wisdom. His deliverance is solely the result of God's abundant mercy and grace bestowed upon him. If the angels had not grabbed Lot and his family by their hand and drugged them out, they would have been victims of destruction rather than being recipients of deliverance. Why had Lot chosen to remain within that city for such a long time? We're never told. What does seem clear is that rather than Lot having an influence on the city has now begun to have an influence on him. Lot loses his perspective. Look at verse 17. Verse 17, when they had brought them outside, one said, "Escape for your life. Do not look behind you, and do not stay anywhere in the valley. Escape to the mountains, or you'll be swept away." Now, let me just stop right there. What are you doing? If you're in Lot's shoes, what are you doing? I'm doing what they just told me to do. Not Lot. But Lot said to them, "Oh no, my lords. Now behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have magnified your loving kindness, which you have shown me by saving my life. But I cannot escape to the mountains, for the disaster will overtake me, and I will die. Now behold, this town is near enough to flee to, and it is small. Please let me escape there. Is it not small, that my life may be saved?" He said to him, "Behold, I grant you this request also, not to overthrow the town of which you have spoken. Hurry, escape there, for I cannot do anything until you arrive there." Therefore, the name of the town was called Zoar. Every second is of vital importance, and Lot, he's cogitating his own plan. I can't go to the mountains. Let me go to this place. He thinks the hills somehow are not going to be able to protect him. He wants to remain on the flat land. And twice he says, this is a reasonable request. It's small. It's just a small thing. And graciously, in spite of the audacity of Lot's request, God allows him to flee to Zoar, by the way, which means small. And yet we're going to see here in a moment that he won't go to the mountains because of fear, and so he wants to stay in Zoar. He's not going to stay in Zoar, and he's going to go to the mountains because of fear. That's where Lot's at. Throughout the entire account, it is demonstrated over and over again that Lot's safety and security have come not because of his wisdom, not even because of his willingness or cooperation. It's because of God's grace and mercy. And then the final chapter of his life, he loses his family. He loses his wife in verse 26. Verse 26, but his wife from behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Even their miraculous escape from destruction was not enough to overcome the pull that the city had on Mrs. Lot. She's outside the city, but apparently her heart's still inside of it. And she stops and she looks back, and her hesitation proves fatal, as it seems that she's overwhelmed by some molten material that rains down, and it leaves behind this fossilized woman who came close to deliverance, were it not for a choice. He lost his daughters, verse 30. In verse 30, Lot went up from Zoar. You remember, that's where he just had to go. He leaves Zoar, he stays, and he goes to the mountains. His two daughters with him, for he was afraid to stay in Zoar. And he stayed in a cave, he and his two daughters. The firstborn said to the younger, our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come into us after the manner of the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and let us lie with him, that we may preserve our family through our father. So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. On the following day, the firstborn said to the younger, behold, I lay last night with my father. Let us make him drink wine tonight also. Then you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve our family through our father. So they made their father drink wine that night also. The younger also arose and lay with him, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. Thus both the daughters of Lot were with child by their father. The firstborn bore a son and named him Moab. He's the father of the Moabites to this day. As for the younger, she bore a son, called his name Ben-Ammi. He is the father of the sons of Ammon to this day. And if you're familiar with Israel's history, those two are going to be some profound enemies of the nation of Israel. You remember why Lot and Abram separated back in chapter 13? They had so much stuff. Look, we can't even stay together, we have so much stuff. And now Lot's got a duffel bag and two daughters living in a cave. That's where one decision has led him. All of that's been lost. Back in chapter 13, he makes a single decision in his life. It's a decision that was self-focused, it was superficial, it was a choice based on what would benefit him, what would increase his bank account. He moves toward and then into the cities of the plain. And now, in the final scene of his life, we find that he doesn't even have control of his own mind and his own body. He sacrificed that too. Now, I understand Peter references Lot as a righteous man. I'm still trying to wrap my head around some of that. But these young ladies, deprived of prospective husbands, are quick to implement a set of standards that would have gone over very well, I have to believe, in Sodom. They're more concerned with preserving their family line than they are in obeying God. They're more interested in incest with their father than respecting and honoring their father. Now, Lot and his family may have never actually participated in any of the activities of Sodom. But that city killed his son-in-laws. turned his wife into a pillar of salt, and it destroyed the moral fiber of his kids. And it's a single decision. Now, you feel kind of down, kind of beat down now with all of that. Let's end on a positive note here. So go back over to Hebrews chapter 11. And I want us to look at a very different example of a man who makes a great decision. It comes in the form of Moses. With the exception of Jesus, there is no person who stands as a better example of making right choices than what Moses does. Now, Moses, he made his share of some mistakes. But Moses is more than just a guy who happens to write down the law of God. He makes some decisions that are good and right in terms of what to accept and what to reject. And the Hebrew writer points to those here for us. Now, we're not going to take time to delve into any detail, but notice in verse 23 that the story of Moses in Hebrews chapter 11 actually starts with the decision that his parents made to spare Moses' life. Were it not for the decision of courage that his parents made, Moses would have never been alive. But they make a decision to fear God more than to fear Pharaoh, and it doesn't just determine the destiny of a man. Their decision determined the destiny of a nation in regard to Israel. Moses, picking up verse 24. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. Have you stopped to think about what Moses had to say no to in order to become the man that the Hebrew writer is talking about here? One thing he had to give up was tangible prestige. Understand that for the first 40 years of Moses' life, he is the prince of Egypt. And Egypt in that day is not some third world nation. It is one of the wealthiest, most advanced civilizations in that particular day. Moses would have been highly educated. He would have been skilled as a part of the royal court. He would have enjoyed all of the perks that position afforded to him. And yet at the age of 40, he faces a critical decision. Either I am going to be a full-fledged Egyptian, or I'm going to go and I'm going to join my own people. Understand, if he remains on the throne of Egypt, he would have wealth and power, he would have political clout, far-reaching authority, an impressive title, incredible influence, and yet the Hebrew writer says he gave it all up. Now, from a worldly standpoint, people would look at that and say he made a foolish decision. That he gave up everything of value and he in turn got nothing in value back. Moses didn't see it that way. The writer also emphasizes that he surrendered evident pleasures. The consequences of sin are often painful, but sin itself is often enjoyable. It satisfies our pride. It prompts our lust. It provides momentary feelings of contentment. But the Hebrew writer reminds us that there are two things connected to sin that are always permanent. Number one, its pleasures are always evil. And number two, its pleasures are always passing. So Moses, he is in the palace, he eats the best food, he lives in the finest housing, he wears the best clothes, he's got the finest recreation available to him, he rests in the finest comfort, and he chooses to leave all of what the world claimed to be valuable behind for what God promised him. Moses didn't get any great wealth. So I'm thinking, he lays behind Egypt, all of that, and what does he get? He gets this group of people. All they do is mumble and complain, and they hate his leadership. They just always want to go back to Egypt. That leads to a third point. He said no to worldly treasure. In 1922, King Tut's tomb was discovered by archaeologists. And one of the things that was different about King Tut's tomb is that it was virtually intact. Now, there had been some things that were taken from it. But King Tut's The belongings of his tomb, I believe, they're in the British Museum. They are insured for $26 million, the contents of that. His coffin the gold in his coffin is valued at $1.7 million. That's just in his coffin. And here's the thing. Historians believe King Tut was at best a fifth-rate pharaoh. He lived about 100 years after Moses. What does that tell you in terms of what Moses could have had? The wealth that would have been available to him. And yet, in the entire life of Moses, there is not a single occasion in Scripture where Moses ever waxes nostalgic or even remotely begins to reminisce about what he could have had or who he could have been if he would have stayed in Egypt. Now, the thought may have crossed his mind when the Israelites are complaining. What I find interesting about that is the folks that leave under his leadership were not former princes. They were former slaves. And yet all they want to do is go back to the good life. You know, let's go back and eat leeks. I've had leeks before. You might like leeks. You may be a fan of leeks. Man, you can keep your leeks, okay? I know, you're going to tell me you just haven't had them cooked right. They want to go back to the good life. Man, I remember when we had so much food, it was incredible. What I find interesting is that the one man among them who actually left something of value behind never says one word of regret about it. Never looks back and says, if only I'd have stayed there, how much money could I have had? No, the word considering there, by the way, in verse 26, it's a word that describes careful thought. This was not a rash decision that Moses made. He took time and effort to think things through. This is a major decision in his life. He weighs the pros and the cons. He looks at what Egypt has to offer, and he looks at the offerings of God. And from, a worldly standpoint, it seemed that it was utter foolishness to trade the visible wealth of Egypt for leading this handful of malcontents. But Moses arrives at a different conclusion, and that is that an unseen Messiah was of much greater value than all of the visible riches of Egypt. Every day, we're faced with similar choices. And friends, those choices matter. Some of them are small, some of them are significant, and sometimes you never realize how significant it will be. As I mentioned, I worked for public supermarkets. I'd worked my way up. By year 7 or 8, I was actually an assistant manager of a store. I am 1 week into, I've got promoted to assistant manager, 1 week into it. I'm absolutely, utterly miserable. My wife, Bev, she threw a party from some folks at church come over and celebrate my great promotion, and she leaves and she looks at me and she says, "What is the matter with you? You act like you lost your best friend." I just looked at her, I said, "I hate it." I went from working 40, 50 hours a week to working 60, 70, 80, 90 hours a week. For a year, I tried to get out. Tried to find another job. Nobody would touch me because I was working with Publix. It was obviously one of their big customers in Florida. I was trying to do stuff that was, kind of interconnected. Had several interviews with Frito-Lay. When you quit, you come talk to us. So are you guaranteeing me a job? No, we can't do that. I've got a wife and 2 kids. I'm not quitting a job that I have for one that may or may not happen. I made a decision. I can't do this anymore. It's killing me and my family. It's killing me spiritually. I had to work every third Sunday, open to close. And so I made a decision. I'm going to go in. I'm going back to a stock crew. 42% cut in pay. It was one of the best decisions I've ever made in my life. At the time, did I know it was going to be one of the best decisions? No. But that's what it turned out to be. Because then I had to find something to do. This is what it ended up being. I remember, Russ's dad would tell the story. He didn't set out to be a preacher. I didn't even set out to be a Christian, let alone a preacher. But that decision led to what I'm doing now. And yeah, there's challenges with preaching, but I tell you what, one of the benefits of preaching is you get to hang around with some of the finest folks in the whole world. And I didn't know that when I made that decision. And those of us who are older, you can look back in your life and you can see a decision that you made that, man, you look at that and you say, man, when I made that decision, I didn't think it was going to have this kind of impact. And that's probably where Lot was. And that may have even been where Moses was. I don't know what this is going to turn out. I know this is a better choice. One arrow points us in the direction of Sodom and Egypt. The other arrow points us in the direction of the riches that are offered to us in Christ. And the decision that we make at that crossroad determines whether a reward is temporal or whether it's eternal. Following Jesus doesn't mean that you're going to be immune to difficulty. It doesn't mean if you make a decision to obey Jesus that you're never going to have to make another hard choice in your life. In fact, just the opposite of that. And even righteous people make decisions that are foolish and sometimes they're harmful. Christians aren't people who make mistakes, but hopefully they're the kind of people that learn from the mistakes that they make. Every one of us tonight, Jesus says, is on one of just two roads. And so as you look in the mirror tonight as we close, which of those two roads are you on? Because choices matter. And understand that separate decisions are not disconnected from one another, but those conglomerations of decisions are moving us in a certain direction and toward a very predictable destination. And so are you on a road that Lot chose? Are you on a road that Moses chose? Because for each of those men, we look at them and we see one decision that made a dramatic difference in their lives. And for Moses, an eternal difference. You need to enter the narrow gate tonight. There's no better time than now to do that. To render obedience to the gospel of Jesus. Or if you are a Christian already, be focused on the decisions that you're making, that they're always moving you in the direction of getting closer to God. If we can help you in any way, won't you make that need known? Why don't you stand?